The sound of the thick, heavy manila folder sliding across my custom glass dining table was the only noise in the room. It was a sharp, grating sound, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. I looked down at the folder, then up at the people sitting in my home. My name is Arthur. I am 32 years old, and I live in a penthouse apartment on the 24th floor, right in the heart of the city. I had spent the last 2 days preparing for this family dinner. I bought premium steaks, aged for 28 days. I roasted asparagus with garlic and parmesan, and I poured glasses of a very expensive red wine that I had been saving for a special occasion. I thought my family was finally coming over to celebrate my recent promotion. I was wrong. They were here for a hostile takeover. My father, Robert, sat at the head of my table, a position he had assumed the moment he walked through my door. He kept his hand firmly on the folder he had just pushed toward me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. Next to him sat my mother, Patricia, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was staring intently at her half-eaten steak, deliberately avoiding my gaze. But the worst part of the picture was sitting directly across from me. My younger brother, Caleb, and his newly minted fiancée, Chloe. Caleb was 28, dressed in a designer sweater that I knew for a fact he could not afford. He had his arm draped protectively around Chloe's shoulders. Chloe was rubbing her slightly rounded belly, putting on a performance of delicate vulnerability. "Open it," my father commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority he had wielded over me my entire childhood. I didn't move. The city lights from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them cast long shadows across the room. "What is this, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is a quitclaim deed," my father said smoothly. "We had a lawyer draw it up yesterday. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line, and the title of this penthouse transfers to Caleb and Chloe." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the joke. But nobody laughed. The silence in the penthouse stretched on, thick and suffocating. I looked at Caleb. He wasn't looking at me with apology. He was looking around my living room, eyeing the velvet sofa and the massive flat-screen television, like a king surveying his newly conquered territory. He already looked like he owned the place. "You want me to give my home to Caleb?" I stated, repeating the absurdity out loud to see if it made any more sense. "Didn't, Arthur, be reasonable." My mother suddenly chimed in, her voice taking on that high-pitched, pleading tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. "Caleb is going to be a father. He is starting a family. They need space. They need security. You are a single man. What on earth do you need 3 bedrooms and a panoramic city view for? It is selfish to hoard all this space when your brother is trying to build a life." I felt a familiar, cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. This was the dynamic. It had always been the dynamic. Caleb was the golden boy, the one who needed protecting, the one who deserved the world handed to him on a silver platter. I was the workhorse, the one expected to pull the plow and ask for nothing in return. "I need 3 bedrooms, I said slowly, enunciating every word. "Because I paid for 3 bedrooms. This is my home." Caleb scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound. "Come on, Artie. Don't be like that. Chloe and I are struggling. My last startup didn't pan out, you know that. We are living in a tiny 1-bedroom box. The baby needs a proper nursery, a safe building with a doorman. You make great money. You can easily rent a nice studio downtown. Family helps family, right?" He smiled. It was a sickening, entitled smile. He was asking me to make myself homeless so he could play the role of a successful family man. A role he hadn't earned a single day in his life. He wanted to step into my life, wear my clothes and sleep under my roof, all while I footed the bill. I looked down at the folder again. Inside that folder was a piece of paper designed to erase 10 years of my blood, sweat, and absolute grind. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just let the cold reality wash over me. The ambush was set. Let me get this completely straight, I said, leaning back in my dining chair and steepling my fingers. I focused entirely on my father. You came into my home, ate the food I cooked, drank my wine, and now you are demanding that I sign over a property worth over $1.2 million. A property that I hold the sole mortgage on. Don't exaggerate the numbers, Arthur, my father snapped, waving his hand dismissively. We know how real estate works. We also know you have a mortgage. We aren't asking you to pay the mortgage off immediately. You just keep making the monthly payments like you always do. Consider it your contribution to your new niece or nephew. Your duty as the older brother. The sheer audacity of the demand hit me like a physical blow. They didn't just want the asset. They wanted me to be their indentured servant. They wanted me to move out, live somewhere else, and continue paying thousands of dollars every single month for a luxury penthouse that Caleb would live in. I did the math in my head. It was an automatic reflex. I had put down exactly $180,000 in cold hard cash for the down payment. Over the last 4 years, I had poured tens of thousands more into renovations, custom flooring, and high-end appliances. Every single cent came from my bank account. No cosigner, no family help, no trust fund, just me. And if I say no? I asked quietly. My father's demeanor changed instantly. The smooth, commanding patriarch vanished, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. He leaned forward, slamming his palms flat against the glass table. The silverware rattled. Chloe jumped in her seat, clutching Caleb's arm. If you say no, my father growled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, we will take you to court. We will sue you for everything you have. We will drag your name through the mud. On what grounds? I asked, genuinely curious about the legal fiction they had cooked up in their heads. On the grounds that this property was meant to be a family investment. My father lied, not even blinking. We will tell a judge that we gave you the seed money. We will say there was an oral agreement that this house belongs to the family trust, and you are breaching your fiduciary duty by locking your brother out when he is in need. By the time our lawyers are done with you, you will be buried in legal fees. You will lose the house anyway, and you will be bankrupt. Dad is right, Arthur, Caleb chimed in, leaning forward with a look of fake sympathy. Don't do this the hard way. It's going to look terrible for you. A rich, single guy throwing his pregnant sister-in-law out onto the street? The courts hate that. The internet hates that. You'll lose your job. Just sign the paper. You can start over. You're good at that. I looked at my mother. Are you hearing this? I asked her. Are you actually sitting there and letting them threaten me like this? My mother's eyes filled with crocodile tears. She reached out and touched her napkin, dabbing at her dry eyes. Arthur, please, don't make your father angry. His blood pressure can't take this. Why do you always have to be so difficult? Caleb needs this more than you do. You have always been so independent, so capable. Caleb needs a foundation. You owe it to this family to provide that foundation. I owed them nothing. That was the absolute, undeniable truth. I looked around my beautiful home. I looked at the imported Italian marble in the kitchen. I looked at the hardwood floors I had picked out myself. This was my sanctuary. This was the fortress I had built to protect myself from the exact people sitting at this table. They thought they had me backed into a corner. They thought I was the same desperate, approval-seeking teenager who used to beg for their attention. They thought the threat of a lawsuit and public shame would make me crumble, pick up the pen, and sign my life away just to keep the peace. They relied on my sense of guilt. They weaponized the concept of family to commit financial robbery. I reached out and placed my hand on the manila folder. My father's eyes tracked my movement. A glimmer of triumph flashed across Caleb's face. He thought he had won. He thought I was going to open it, sign it, and hand him the keys to his new kingdom. I didn't open the folder. Instead, I picked it up, feeling the weight of the legal documents inside. Then, very calmly, I slid it right back across the glass table. It stopped inches from my father's plate. No, I said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond. My father stared at the folder, then up at me, his jaw tightening. "Excuse me?" "No," I repeated, my voice steady, devoid of any emotion. "I will not sign my property over to Caleb. I will not continue to pay a mortgage on a house I do not live in. And I absolutely will not be blackmailed in my own dining room." Caleb stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Are you out of your mind, Arthur? You can't say no. We told our landlord we are moving out at the end of the month. Where are we supposed to go?" "That sounds like a Caleb problem," I replied, not breaking eye contact with my father. "Not an Arthur problem. Maybe you should have secured a house before you canceled your lease. Or maybe you should go get a job that actually pays the bills instead of playing pretend CEO at startups that go bankrupt every 6 months." "How dare you!" my mother shrieked, finally dropping the fragile victim act. She slammed her hands on the table. "He is your brother. He is giving us a grandchild. You are a selfish, cold-hearted monster. I don't know how I raised a son with ice in his veins." "You didn't raise me," I shot back, the years of suppressed anger finally cracking through the ice. "You housed me. You fed me the bare minimum. You saved all your actual parenting, and all your money, for him." I pointed a finger at Caleb, who was now red in the face, breathing heavily. My father stood up, towering over the table. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "You listen to me, you arrogant little punk. You think you are untouchable because you have a fancy title and a nice suit? You are nothing without this family. I will ruin you. I will hire the most vicious lawyers in this city, and we will take this penthouse. We will freeze your assets. We will make sure you don't have a dime to your name by the time this is over. We will destroy you." I sat perfectly still. I didn't flinch. I let him yell. I let him spit his threats. Because what my father didn't understand, what none of them understood, was the fundamental mistake they had just made. They thought I was just a guy with a spreadsheet job. They thought I was a paper pusher they could easily intimidate with legal jargon and empty threats of financial ruin. But I am not a paper pusher. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career, my entire life's work, is built on destroying corrupt empires. I am the man that massive corporations call when they suspect their executives of embezzlement. I am the man who tracks down hidden offshore accounts, uncovers shell companies, and exposes fraudulent loans. I dig through thousands of pages of financial data to find the single lie that brings the whole house of cards crashing down. I hunt financial predators for a living. I follow the money, and the money never, ever lies. "Get out," I said quietly. "We are not leaving until you sign," Caleb yelled. I stood up, pulling my phone from my pocket. "I am going to count to 10. If you are not in the elevator by the time I reach 10, I am calling building security. If you fight security, they will call the police. You can explain your oral family trust to the cops while they put you in handcuffs for trespassing." My father glared at me, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He grabbed the manila folder off the table. "You just declared war, Arthur. Remember that. You brought this on yourself." He turned and marched toward the door. My mother followed, shooting me one last look of disgust. Caleb wrapped his arm around Chloe and steered her away, muttering curses under his breath. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the massive apartment. I stood alone in the dining room, the half-eaten steaks cooling on the table. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence before a storm. They thought they had declared war on a defenseless target, but they were about to learn that they had just picked a fight with a ghost, and I was going to audit their entire existence. To understand how my family reached the point of trying to steal my home, you have to understand the fundamental rule of our household. It wasn't written down anywhere, but it was etched into the walls, woven into the carpets, and repeated in every interaction. The rule was simple. The oldest son must suffer to build character, and the youngest son must be pampered to protect his potential. I was the oldest son. Caleb was the youngest. We were only 4 years apart in age, but we lived in two entirely different universes. I remember the exact moment the divide became permanent. It was my 16th birthday. For a teenage boy in the United States, turning 16 is a massive milestone. It represents freedom. It represents a driver's license and the open road. For months, I had been dropping hints. I left brochures for cheap, used sedans on the kitchen counter. I offered to take on extra chores to pay for gas and insurance. I just wanted something with 4 wheels and an engine. On the morning of my birthday, I came downstairs with that nervous, electric feeling in my chest. My father was drinking coffee and reading the business section of the newspaper. My mother was wiping down the counters. "Happy birthday, Arthur," my mother said, handing me a small, flat envelope. I tore it open, my heart hammering. Inside was a piece of plastic, a yearly transit pass for the city bus system. I stared at it, the plastic feeling heavy and cold in my hand. "A bus pass?" I asked, trying to hide the crushing disappointment in my voice. My father didn't even look up from his paper. "Cars are expensive, Arthur. Insurance for a 16-year-old boy is robbery. Gas is unpredictable. This bus pass will get you to school, to the library, and anywhere else you need to go. It builds character, teaches you how to navigate the real world. You need to learn how to be self-sufficient." I spent my 16th birthday walking 2 miles in the freezing rain to the bus stop, waiting 40 minutes for the number 12 bus, and sitting in the back row smelling like damp wool. I told myself my parents were just being financially responsible. We were middle class. Maybe things were tight. I swallowed my pride and rode that bus every single day for the next 4 years. I told myself it was making me a stronger man. Then, 4 years later, Caleb turned 16. I was home from college for the weekend. I woke up to the sound of loud cheering in the driveway. I looked out the window and saw my parents standing there, beaming with pride. In the middle of the driveway sat a sleek, dark blue BMW coupe. It wasn't brand new, but it was flawless. It had a massive red bow strapped to the hood. Caleb ran out of the front door, screaming with joy. He hugged my mother, high-fived my father, and jumped into the driver's seat, revving the engine. The roar of the exhaust echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. I walked downstairs, feeling completely numb. I stood on the porch watching them celebrate. My father saw me and smiled, waving me over. "Look at this beauty, Arthur. We found a great deal on it." "A BMW?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I thought about the hours I had spent shivering at bus stops. "Dad, I thought you said insurance for a 16-year-old boy was robbery. I thought cars were too expensive." My father's smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound annoyance. He walked over to me, lowering his voice so Caleb wouldn't hear. "Don't be petty, Arthur. It's ugly. The situations are completely different. Caleb is a different kind of kid than you. He needs to build a network. He needs to project a certain image for his social life and his future business ventures. You were always a grinder. You didn't need the flash. Caleb needs the confidence boost." I looked at Caleb, who was taking selfies in the driver's seat of a luxury car paid for by the same people who told me a $2 bus ticket built character. That was the moment the illusion shattered. It wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about worth. In their eyes, I was built for endurance, and Caleb was built for display. I was a workhorse, expected to survive on scraps and silence. Caleb was a racehorse, requiring premium fuel and constant applause. From that day forward, I stopped asking them for anything. I realized that if I wanted a life, I would have to build it entirely with my own 2 hands, in complete isolation from the people who were supposed to love me. The disparity only widened when it came to higher education. By the time I graduated high school, I had maintained a perfect grade point average. I was accepted into a highly respected state university with a solid accounting program. I sat my parents down at the kitchen table to discuss the finances. I had the tuition bills, the housing costs, and a detailed spreadsheet of my projected expenses. We need to talk about how we are handling this, I said, sliding the papers toward my father. I have some scholarships, but there is still a gap for tuition and room and board. My father leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, adopting a grave, solemn expression. Arthur, I have some tough news. The economy is rough right now. My business took a hit this quarter. Our cash flow is severely restricted. We simply cannot afford to write a check for your college tuition. What about the college fund? I asked, panic rising in my throat. You always told us you were putting money away for our education. My mother looked down at the table, refusing to make eye contact. Things came up, Arthur. Emergency expenses around the house. We had to use that money to keep the family afloat. You are a smart, capable young man. You can take out student loans. It is an investment in your future. Good debt. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just packed up my papers and went to the bank. I signed my name on promissory notes that chained me to tens of thousands of dollars in debt before I even stepped foot in a classroom. My college experience was a masterclass in survival. I moved into a cramped, noisy dorm room because I had maxed out my federal loans just to cover tuition. I couldn't afford the campus meal plan. I got a job working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour logistics warehouse on the edge of town. My schedule was brutal. I went to classes from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. I studied in the library until 6. I slept for exactly 4 hours. Then, I put on steel-toed boots and loaded delivery trucks from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. I was a ghost. I had dark circles permanently etched under my eyes. My meals consisted of whatever I could afford from the vending machines in the warehouse break room. Stale peanut butter crackers, instant ramen noodles cooked with tap water in a microwave, and endless cups of black, bitter coffee. While my peers were going to frat parties, networking events, and spring break trips, I was hauling boxes in the freezing cold, desperate to make my next loan interest payment. I survived. I graduated at the top of my class. 3 years later, Caleb graduated high school. His grades were average at best. He had no extracurriculars, no drive, and no clear plan. He decided he wanted to go to an expensive, private liberal arts college on the West Coast because he heard the parties were legendary and he wanted to find himself. The tuition was triple what my state university cost. I waited for my father to give him the "economy is rough" speech. I waited for my mother to tell him to go to the bank and sign away his financial freedom. Instead, I logged onto social media one afternoon and saw a post from my mother. It was a picture of Caleb standing in front of a sprawling, palm tree-lined campus. The caption read, "So incredibly proud to drop our youngest off at his dream school. We know you are destined for greatness. Caleb, we are so happy to support your journey." They paid for everything. Full out-of-state tuition. A luxury off-campus apartment because Caleb found the dorms too restrictive. A premium meal plan. They even gave him a monthly allowance so he could focus entirely on his studies. I remember sitting in my tiny, unair-conditioned apartment, eating a bowl of plain rice, looking at photos of my brother drinking expensive cocktails on a beach in California, funded by the same people who told me they couldn't afford to buy me a textbook. I didn't call them to complain. I didn't ask for fairness. I simply internalized the final lesson my family had to teach me. The world is incredibly cruel. The people closest to you will bleed you dry if you let them, and the only person who will ever protect Arthur is Arthur. My salvation didn't come from a therapist or a self-help book. It came from a man named David. In my senior year of college, amidst the grueling warehouse shifts and the relentless studying, I landed a highly coveted internship at one of the top financial auditing firms in the city. The pay was decent, but the experience was the real prize. The partner in charge of my division was David. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp, hawk-like eyes, graying temples, and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the boardroom. He didn't suffer fools, and he demanded perfection. One Friday night in November, the office was deserted. It was past 9 o'clock. I was sitting in my cubicle, cross-referencing a massive stack of corporate expense reports, trying to find a discrepancy in a client's travel budget. David walked out of his corner office, putting his coat on. He stopped when he saw the light glowing from my desk. He walked over, leaning against the partition. "Arthur, it is Friday night. Go home. The numbers will still be here on Monday." "I just want to finish this reconciliation, sir," I said, not looking away from the spreadsheet. "I think they are hiding personal expenses under client entertainment, but I need to prove the paper trail." David stood there for a long moment watching me. He didn't praise my work ethic. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down next to me. "You work harder than anyone else in this building," David said quietly. "I know about the warehouse job. I know you are putting yourself through school. You have grit, Arthur. That is rare." "Thank you, sir," I replied, feeling a rare flush of pride. "Don't thank me yet," David said, his voice turning hard. "Because grit alone will get you killed in this world. Working hard just makes you an excellent target for parasites. People see a workhorse, and their first instinct isn't to reward it. Their first instinct is to load a heavier wagon onto its back and see how far it can pull before its legs snap." I stopped typing and looked at him. His words struck a chord so deep inside me it felt physical. I thought of my father. I thought of Caleb. "In our line of work, Arthur, we hunt liars," David continued, tapping his finger on my desk. "Corporate executives, corrupt managers, people who steal and smile while they do it. They all operate on the assumption that nobody is paying attention to the details. They rely on trust. Trust is a liability." He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "Let me give you the only piece of advice that matters. Track every single dollar like it is evidence in a murder trial. Do not trust words. Do not trust promises. Do not trust relationships. Drown them in paper. Document every transaction. Save every receipt. Archive every email. Because one day someone is going to try to rewrite history. They are going to try to take what is yours and claim it was theirs all along. And when that day comes, you don't argue with them. You don't scream. You slap a binder full of undeniable data on the table, and you break their jaw with the truth." David thought he was teaching me how to be a forensic accountant. He didn't know he was giving me the exact weapon I needed to survive my own family. From that night on, my mindset fundamentally shifted. I wasn't just a victim of my parents' favoritism anymore. I was an auditor gathering data on a hostile entity. I began documenting my personal life with the same clinical precision I applied to corporate fraud. I opened a secure cloud drive. Every time my father refused to help me financially, I saved the text message. Every time they paid for Caleb's failed ventures, I made a note of the date and the amount discussed. I kept pristine records of my student loan payments, my bank statements, and my tax returns. I built an impenetrable fortress of data around my finances. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for. I just knew that one day, they would come for me. They had drained their golden boy of his potential, and eventually, they would need a new host to feed on. When they finally came knocking, I was going to be ready. I was going to have the binder. By the time I was 30 years old, I had executed my plan flawlessly. I didn't just survive. I thrived. I stayed at David's firm, climbing the ranks with a singular, obsessive focus. I became a senior forensic accountant, specializing in tracing hidden assets in high-stakes divorces and corporate embezzlements. I commanded a massive salary, and because I lived a disciplined, minimalist life, my bank account swelled. I paid off every single cent of my student loans. I remember clicking the final Submit Payment button on my laptop. I didn't celebrate. I just felt a cold, heavy armor settle over my shoulders. I was finally free. Now it was time to build the fortress. I wanted a piece of the world that belonged entirely to me. A place with a deed that only had one name on it. A place where my family had zero leverage. I found the Penthouse on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was raw space on the top floor of a new luxury high-rise downtown. It had exposed concrete pillars, massive windows overlooking the skyline, and complete silence. It was high above the noise, the dirt, and the chaos of the city. I bought it immediately. I put down $180,000 in cash. I signed the closing documents with a pen that felt as heavy as a sword. Buyer, Arthur. Sole owner. No co-signers, no family trust, no strings attached. I spent the next year turning it into a masterpiece. I hired contractors to lay dark, rich hardwood floors. I installed custom lighting, bought heavy, masculine furniture, and built a dedicated home office with multiple monitors and a fireproof safe. It was my sanctuary. When it was finally finished, a small, foolish part of me, the inner child that still desperately wanted his parents to acknowledge his worth, decided to invite them over for a housewarming dinner. I wanted them to walk into my fortress and finally admit that the workhorse had built an empire. It was a disaster from the moment the elevator doors opened. My parents arrived with Caleb in tow. They didn't bring a bottle of wine. They didn't bring a card. Caleb walked in, tracking wet dirt onto my brand new hardwood floors. He didn't take his shoes off. He just wandered into my living room and threw himself onto my custom velvet sofa, putting his dirty sneakers right on the edge of the glass coffee table. "Whoa, Artie," Caleb said, looking around dismissively. "A bit stark, isn't it? Looks like a villain's lair. You need a woman's touch in here to warm it up." My mother walked around, trailing her fingers over the quartz countertops in the kitchen. She didn't look impressed. She looked resentful. "It is very big, Arthur, and very high up. It feels isolating. Are you sure this was a wise investment? You know real estate bubbles burst." My father stood by the window looking out at the city. He didn't congratulate me. He immediately started interrogating me about the financials. "What are the HOA fees on a place like this? Must be astronomical. And the property taxes? You are highly leveraged, Arthur. One bad quarter at your firm and you could lose it all. You always did have a habit of biting off more than you can chew." I stood in my own kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. They were standing in $1 million piece of real estate that I had bought with my own blood and sweat, and all they could do was tear it down. They couldn't stand the fact that I had succeeded without them. My success was a glaring spotlight on their failure with Caleb, who was currently living in their basement after his second company went bankrupt. That night, as I cleaned up the dishes they left behind, the last remaining thread of emotional attachment to my family snapped. I realized they would never view me as a son to be proud of. They viewed me as an anomaly, a threat to their narrative, and, most dangerously, an untapped resource. I went into my office, opened my fireproof safe, and pulled out my thick, black binder. I placed the deed to the penthouse inside it. I filed the receipts for the furniture, the closing documents, and the bank statements proving the source of the down payment. I closed the safe and spun the dial. The fortress was sealed. They had shown me exactly who they were. From that day on, I treated my family not as relatives, but as a high-risk liability. And now, 2 years later, sitting at my dining table looking at the quitclaim deed my father had demanded I sign, I knew the war I had been preparing for had finally arrived. The silence in my penthouse lasted exactly 3 days. I knew my father's threat wasn't empty, but a small, irrational part of me wondered if he would actually pull the trigger on his own son. On Thursday morning, while I was drinking my coffee and reviewing a client's quarterly earnings report on my laptop, the lobby concierge buzzed my intercom. He sounded apologetic. He told me there was a process server waiting downstairs. I told him to send the man up. I met him at my door. He handed me a thick, yellow envelope, mumbled a quick confirmation of my identity, and hurried back to the elevator. I carried the envelope to my kitchen island, set my coffee mug down, and opened it. It was a formal civil complaint filed in the county court. The plaintiffs were listed as Robert and Patricia, acting on behalf of the family trust. The defendant was Arthur. I read through the 30-page document, my forensic accountant brain instantly analyzing every claim, every date, and every legal maneuver. It was a breathtaking work of pure fiction. The lawsuit alleged that the $180,000 I used for the down payment on the penthouse was not my savings, but rather a pooled family asset entrusted to me for safekeeping. It claimed there was a long-standing oral agreement that this property would serve as a communal family home, specifically intended to house any sibling who fell on hard times. It accused me of breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, and elder abuse for causing my parents emotional distress. They were asking a judge to force a transfer of the deed into a formal trust controlled by my father, and they were suing me for their legal fees. It was legally flimsy, completely unprovable, and entirely based on lies. But that wasn't the point. The point was the process. They knew a lawsuit takes months, sometimes years. They wanted to drown me in legal paperwork, force me to hire expensive defense attorneys, and bleed me dry until I surrendered the penthouse just to make the nightmare stop. But the legal attack was only the first prong of their strategy. The second prong was a coordinated smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation and force me into submission through public shame. That evening, my phone started buzzing with notifications from distant relatives and high school acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. I logged onto my social media accounts. Caleb had gone on the offensive. He didn't just post a status update. He launched a full-scale public relations war, playing the ultimate victim. He had posted a long, dramatic essay accompanied by a black and white photo of him and Chloe looking devastated. The text was a masterpiece of manipulation. He wrote about how hard the economy was, how he was working tirelessly to prepare for his unborn child, and how his own flesh and blood, his wealthy, single corporate brother, was hoarding a massive luxury penthouse while kicking his pregnant sister-in-law out onto the street. He used words like greed, heartless, and betrayal. He tagged all of our extended family members. The comments were a toxic sludge of manufactured outrage. My Aunt Margaret wrote that she was praying for my soul and that money had turned me into a monster. A cousin I hadn't seen since I was 10 commented that family always comes first and that I was a disgrace to our last name. People who had absolutely no idea how many hours I worked, how much debt I had clawed my way out of, or how much Caleb had leached off my parents, were suddenly experts on my morality. I sat on my velvet sofa, watching the comments roll in. They were trying to isolate me. They were trying to make me feel so hated, so despised by my own community, that I would cave to their demands just to regain my social standing. It is a classic tactic used by abusers. They flip the script. The perpetrator becomes the victim, and the victim becomes the villain. I didn't reply to a single comment. I didn't post a defense. I took out my phone and took precise, high-resolution screenshots of every single post, every comment, and every tag. I saved them to a dedicated folder on my encrypted drive. Then, I deactivated my social media accounts. I vanished from their radar. If they wanted a war of attrition, they were about to find out that I was built for a siege. The next morning, the psychological warfare escalated. I was sitting at my home office desk, preparing to log into the National Property Registry databases, when my phone screen lit up. It was my mother. I had ignored her previous 5 calls, but she finally decided to leave a voicemail. I pressed play, putting the phone on speaker. I needed to hear her strategy. I needed to document the exact angle of her manipulation. Arthur. Her voice echoed through my silent office. It was trembling, weak, and perfectly pitched to inflict maximum guilt. It is your mother. Please pick up. I haven't slept in 3 days. Your father is sick, Arthur. He is physically sick over this. His blood pressure is dangerously high, and he is having chest pains. The doctor said he needs to avoid stress, and you are killing him with this stubbornness. She paused, a sharp intake of breath designed to sound like a stifled sob. Chloe has been crying nonstop. She is terrified for the baby. Do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to be the reason your nephew is born into a broken family? We are not asking for the world, Arthur. We are just asking you to share a fraction of your massive success with the people who raised you. We sacrificed everything for you. Then, the tone shifted. The fragile, weeping mother vanished, replaced by a cold, spiteful woman. It was cognitive dissonance in real time. She had to convince herself that I was evil so she could justify stealing from me. I never thought I could raise a son so utterly lacking in basic human decency, she hissed into the receiver. You sit up there in your glass tower, counting your money, completely blind to the suffering of your own blood. You have become a cold, calculating machine. If you don't call our lawyer by Monday and sign that paper, you will be dead to me. Do you hear me? Dead to me. Fix this, Arthur. Or we will break you. The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the ceiling. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a phantom pain for a mother I realized I never actually had. The woman on that recording didn't love me. She viewed me as a malfunctioning utility. I was a broken ATM that was refusing to dispense cash to her favorite child. Her message was a textbook example of psychological abuse. Contained every classic element. First, the guilt trip regarding my father's health, making me responsible for his physical well-being. Second, the weaponization of the unborn child, painting me as a threat to an innocent baby. Third, the absolute rewriting of history, claiming they sacrificed everything for me when, in reality, they had given me a bus pass and a pile of student debt. And finally, the ultimate threat of abandonment. Years ago, a message like that would have destroyed me. I would have panicked. I would have driven to their house, apologized for being selfish, and begged for their forgiveness. I would have signed the deed just to make the tension go away. But not today. Today, I took that audio file, exported it, and dropped it right into the digital evidence binder I was building. They thought they were dealing with a frightened son. They didn't realize they were leaving a pristine trail of evidence for a forensic auditor. Every time they lied, every time they threatened me, every time they tried to manipulate the narrative, they were just handing me ammunition. They were digging their own grave, and my only job was to stand back and let them keep shoveling. I closed the audio file and turned my attention to the two massive monitors on my desk. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the investigator. I cracked my knuckles, a nervous habit I only indulged when I was about to dive deep into a complex financial web. I opened my encrypted browser and logged into the premium investigative databases my firm utilized. These weren't Google searches. These were the municipal, state, and federal databases that track the financial heartbeat of every citizen in the country. If you own property, if you take out a loan, if you file for bankruptcy, or if you fail to pay your taxes, there is a digital footprint. And I know exactly how to track it. I started with Caleb, my brilliant, entrepreneurial brother who was supposedly just suffering from a string of bad luck. I pulled up the county clerk's public records database and ran a search on his social security number, which I had saved years ago from an old family tax return my father had carelessly left on the kitchen counter. The results populated on my screen in seconds. It was a bloodbath of financial incompetence. There were 3 separate civil judgments against him from unpaid credit card companies, totaling over $40,000. There was a lien on a vehicle he had bought 3 years ago, a vehicle that, according to the records, had been repossessed by the bank after he stopped making payments for 8 consecutive months. I cross-referenced the dates of his missed car payments with the dates he had taken a 2-week vacation to Europe with Chloe. He had funded his lifestyle by defaulting on his obligations. But the most damning piece of evidence was a corporate filing. I pulled up the state registry for limited liability companies. Caleb's last startup, a tech consulting firm that he constantly bragged about, had its corporate status revoked 2 years ago for failure to pay state franchise taxes. He hadn't just gone out of business. He had been legally dissolved by the government for tax delinquency. He was legally insolvent. He was a walking financial black hole. Next, I turned my attention to the real target, the architect of the ambush, my father, Robert. My parents had lived in the same 4-bedroom suburban house for 30 years. I had always assumed it was completely paid off. My father always projected the image of a financially conservative, successful small business owner. He wore nice suits, golfed at a mid-tier country club, and constantly lectured me about the dangers of being over-leveraged. I accessed the municipal property tax database and pulled the deed and mortgage history for their residential address. The original mortgage from 30 years ago was indeed paid off. But my eyes locked onto a document filed just 4 years ago. It was a home equity line of credit. A second mortgage. My father had borrowed $125,000 against the equity of his home. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Why would a man in his 60s, who supposedly had a successful business, suddenly take out a massive loan against his primary residence? I dug deeper. I searched the state uniform commercial code filings. These are public notices filed by creditors to establish a legal claim to assets. There it was. A filing from a high-interest lending company, the kind of predatory lender that people only use when traditional banks refuse to look at them. My father had pledged his business equipment as collateral for a high-risk, short-term loan of $50,000. My parents were not financially secure. They were drowning in debt. They were borrowing money at exorbitant interest rates just to keep the lights on and maintain their country club facade. But where was the cash going? The business hadn't expanded. They hadn't bought a new house. They were funneling massive amounts of liquidity into a void. I needed to find the leak. I needed to trace the cash. And to do that, I needed to cross the line from public records into a gray area that only forensic accountants know how to navigate. I leaned closer to the monitor. The puzzle was almost complete. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously building a timeline on a massive Excel spreadsheet. I plotted every public financial data point I had found. I matched the dates of my father's high-interest loans with the dates of Caleb's business failures and credit defaults. It painted a grim picture of a father constantly bailing out a reckless son. But the math still didn't add up. The loans were too big. The cash burn rate was too fast. There was a missing variable. I needed to see a bank statement. I couldn't hack into their accounts, that was illegal, and I needed my evidence to be admissible in a court of law. But I remembered a vulnerability. My father was old school. He didn't trust paperless billing. He still received physical bank statements in the mail. 2 years ago, during the disastrous housewarming dinner, my father had asked to use my laptop to check his email because his phone had died. He had left a browser tab open, logged into a secure portal for his primary checking account. I hadn't looked at his balances, but I had noticed the URL and the specific regional bank he used. I couldn't access the account now, but I could access something else. Over the years, I had quietly collected copies of canceled checks my parents had written to me for minor things, repaying me for a dinner bill I covered, or a small birthday check they sent before we completely stopped talking. I pulled those images from my encrypted drive. I stared at the routing numbers and the account numbers. Then, I accessed a specialized financial database used by auditors to verify the legitimacy of corporate vendors. It provides metadata about transaction histories without violating privacy laws. It doesn't show balances, but it shows patterns of merchant codes. I ran my father's primary account data through the pattern analysis algorithm. The results loaded, categorized by merchant category codes: groceries, utilities, insurance, standard expenses. But then, a massive, glaring anomaly appeared on the screen. The highest frequency of transactions, accounting for staggering volumes of cash outflow over the last 5 years, was assigned to merchant category code 7995. I didn't need to look up the code. Every forensic accountant knows it by heart. Code 7995. Betting, including casino gaming chips, off-track betting, and wagers. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. It hit me like a freight train. The slow business years. The refusal to pay my college tuition. The sudden, desperate need to take out a second mortgage on a paid-off house. The high-interest predatory loans. It wasn't just favoritism. It wasn't just poor business management. It was an addiction. My father was a degenerate gambler. He had gambled away his business profits. He had gambled away my college fund. He had gambled away his retirement security. And now, he was on the verge of losing his house to the second mortgage lender. He was a desperate man backed into a corner by his own vices. Suddenly, the lawsuit made perfect, terrifying sense. This was never about Caleb. This was never about providing a safe home for an unborn child. That was just the emotional camouflage they used to manipulate me and justify their actions to the rest of the family. My penthouse had appreciated significantly in value since I bought it. If they could force me to sign the quitclaim deed, transferring the title to their family trust, they would instantly gain control of over $400,000 in home equity. They wouldn't let Caleb live here. They would immediately take out a massive loan against my property, pull out hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and use my equity to pay off my father's gambling debts, clear the predatory loans, and bail Caleb out of his credit card judgments. And me? I would be left paying a mortgage on an asset I no longer owned, while my family bled the equity dry at the casino and the country club. I wasn't just a workhorse to them. I was their ultimate bailout package. The last lingering shred of guilt evaporated from my chest, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard fury. They thought they could use the law to rob me blind. They thought they could use my brother's unborn child as a human shield for their financial crimes. I saved the merchant code analysis. I printed the public property records. I compiled Caleb's credit judgments. I placed them all into my black binder, neatly organized behind labeled tabs. The investigation was over. It was time for the execution. Having a binder full of devastating evidence is only half the battle. Knowing how to deploy it in a legal arena requires a very specific type of professional. I didn't need a family lawyer who would try to mediate a peaceful resolution. I didn't want peace. I wanted absolute, unconditional surrender. I needed a legal assassin. I called Vance. Vance was a senior litigator at a high-powered downtown firm. He was 50 years old, wore custom-tailored suits, and had a reputation for being utterly merciless in depositions. He didn't take cases to settle. He took cases to destroy opposing counsel. He charged $800 an hour, and he was worth every single penny. I met him in his corner office overlooking the financial district. He didn't offer me coffee or small talk. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, steepled his fingers, and looked at me. "Arthur, you usually hunt corporate fraud. What brings you to my office?" I placed my thick, black binder on his desk. "Family fraud. They are trying to steal my property. They filed a frivolous lawsuit claiming an oral family trust, and they are currently running a smear campaign to force a settlement." Vance didn't smile. He just opened the binder. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp turning of pages. I watched his eyes scan my meticulously organized spreadsheets, the property deeds, the text messages, and finally, the financial analysis of my father's gambling debt and Caleb's insolvency. When he reached the final page, Vance closed the binder and leaned back in his leather chair. A slow, terrifying smirk spread across his face. "Arthur," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. "Most clients come to me with a mess of emotions and a shoebox full of crumpled receipts. You have just handed me a fully loaded, unpinned grenade. They are claiming they funded this property." "Yes," I replied. "They claim they pooled family resources to buy it. And these records prove they didn't have 2 dimes to rub together when you closed on this property because your father was feeding his liquidity into slot machines and your brother was dodging repo men." Vance tapped the binder. "This is beautiful." They walked into a trap and locked the door behind themselves. "Can we crush the lawsuit?" I asked. "We are going to do much more than that," Vance said, standing up and walking to a whiteboard on the wall. He picked up a black marker. "Defending a lawsuit just means you don't lose. We want them to lose. We want to make this so incredibly painful and expensive for them that they never speak your name again." He drew 3 distinct boxes on the board. Phase 1. The shield, Vance explained, tapping the first box. "I am going to file an immediate motion for declaratory judgment. We are asking the judge to look at the absolute lack of written evidence for this imaginary trust, look at your clean deed, and declare you the sole undisputed owner. The statute of frauds requires real estate transfers to be in writing. Their oral agreement story is legally laughable." He moved to the second box. Phase 2. The gag order. "I will draft a cease and desist letter to your parents, your brother, and every extended family member currently defaming you online. We will inform them that every single false post is a separate count of libel. The public circus ends today. He smiled, tapping the final box. Phase 3. The sword. We file a massive counterclaim. We sue them for abuse of process. We argue they are using the judicial system not to seek justice, but to extort you for an asset. We sue them for every dollar of my legal fees. We sue them for emotional distress. And during the discovery phase of our counterclaim, we will subpoena your father's complete, unredacted bank records. We will drag his gambling addiction into the blinding light of the public record. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. They will panic, I said. My father cares about his country club image more than his own life. If his friends find out he is a broke gambling addict, it will destroy him. Exactly, Vance said, sitting back down. Bullies use the court system because they think the victim will fold under the pressure of legal fees. We are going to reverse the pressure. We are going to put a price tag on their lies. But Arthur, for this to work flawlessly, you have to follow one absolute rule. Name it, I said. No contact, Vance ordered. Total absolute radio silence. They are going to try to provoke you. They will beg, they will threaten, they will show up at your door. You do not answer texts. You do not answer calls. You do not explain yourself. You let me do all the talking. Silence is the only thing a narcissist truly fears because it means they have lost control of the narrative. Can you do that? They are already dead to me, I said. Draft the papers. The execution of Vance's strategy was immediate and brutal. The very next morning, the motion for declaratory judgment and the massive counterclaim were filed with the court. Simultaneously, process servers delivered the cease and desist letters to my parents' house and Caleb's apartment. Then I initiated the lockdown. I blocked my father's number. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked Caleb, Chloe, and every single extended family member who had left a negative comment on social media. I set my email to automatically filter their addresses directly into a hidden archive folder, so I wouldn't even see the subject lines. I instructed the security desk at my office building to flag their names and deny them entry under any circumstances. My penthouse, which had felt like a battleground a week ago, suddenly returned to being a silent, impregnable fortress. The reaction from my family was exactly what Vance had predicted. It started with confusion, rapidly escalated into panic, and finally exploded into desperation. When toxic people are confronted with absolute boundaries, they experience a loss of control that drives them frantic. For 32 years, my parents had relied on my guilt, my desire for approval, and my willingness to engage in their dramatic arguments. By removing myself from the equation entirely, I starved them of their oxygen. On Wednesday evening, I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset reflect off the glass skyscrapers, when the intercom buzzed. It was the lobby concierge. "Mr. Arthur," the concierge said, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "Your father and your brother are down here in the lobby. They are demanding to see you. I told them you were not receiving guests, but they are becoming quite loud. They are causing a disturbance for the other residents." I leaned forward, looking down at the street 24 stories below. "Do not let them pass the front desk," I instructed calmly. "Tell them they need to leave the premises immediately. If they refuse or if they raise their voices again, do not argue with them. Just call the police and have them trespassed from the building." "Understood, sir." I stayed on the balcony. 5 minutes later, I watched the heavy glass doors of the lobby swing open. My father and Caleb marched out onto the sidewalk. My father was red in the face, gesturing aggressively toward the building, his mouth moving in what I could only assume were profanities. Caleb looked less angry and more terrified. He kept looking up at the tower, scanning the balconies, trying to figure out where I was. They stood on the street corner for 10 minutes, arguing with each other. The united front they had presented at my dining table was fracturing. The reality of the counterclaim, the realization that they were now facing financial ruin and public humiliation, was tearing them apart. Finally, They got into Caleb's battered sedan and drove away. I went back inside and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't feel a shred of pity. The silence dragged on for 2 more weeks. During that time, my automated email filters caught over 50 messages. Occasionally, I would open the archive folder just to monitor their mental state, treating the emails like intercepted enemy communications. The progression was fascinating. The first few emails from my mother were full of rage, accusing me of tearing the family apart with my aggressive lawyers. A week later, the tone shifted to begging. She claimed my father was having heart palpitations. She pleaded with me to drop the counterclaim, promising that Caleb would apologize. Caleb's emails were entirely self-serving. He wrote long, rambling messages about how his wife was stressed, how they couldn't afford a lawyer to fight my lawsuit, and how I was ruining his unborn child's life. Not once did he acknowledge the fraud. Not once did they admit to the gambling debt. They just wanted the consequences to disappear. I didn't reply to a single word. Eventually, their lawyer, the man who had drafted the initial frivolous lawsuit, realized his clients were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and financially insolvent. He called Vance. He didn't want to go to court. He didn't want my father's bank records exposed in discovery. He asked for a settlement conference. Vance called me with the news. They want to surrender, Arthur, but they want to do it in a room face to face. They probably think they can still guilt trip you in person. Let them try, I said. Set the meeting. The settlement conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the primary boardroom of Vance's law firm. It was a space designed to intimidate. The room was on the 40th floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying view of the city's financial district. The table was a massive slab of polished mahogany, surrounded by heavy, black leather chairs. It smelled of expensive coffee and ruthless efficiency. I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a blue silk tie. I looked exactly like what I was, a corporate predator ready to dissect a failing asset. I sat on one side of the massive table. Vance sat to my right, unpacking a neat stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase. In front of me, I placed the black binder. Precisely at 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. My family walked in. The physical toll of the last 3 weeks was shocking. My father, who usually carried himself with the arrogant swagger of a country club patriarch, looked deflated. His suit looked slightly too big for him, his shoulders were slumped, and his face was drawn and gray. My mother walked in behind him, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She looked terrified, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent boardroom. Caleb walked in last without Chloe. He tried to maintain a facade of defiance, jutting his chin out and glaring at me, but his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept shifting his weight nervously. They were accompanied by their lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson. Henderson looked exhausted. He carried a battered briefcase and avoided making eye contact with Vance, clearly aware that he had brought a knife to a gunfight. They sat down on the opposite side of the mahogany table. The physical distance across the polished wood felt like a massive chasm. No one said hello. No one offered to shake hands. Henderson cleared his throat, opening his legal pad. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Mr. Vance. Arthur, my clients are prepared to offer a reasonable compromise. This family dispute has gotten out of hand, and they wish to resolve it without further burdening the court system. They are willing to drop their claim to the Penthouse if Arthur agrees to drop his counterclaim and perhaps contribute a modest sum to help Caleb secure a new apartment. For the sake of the grandchild. It was a pathetic opening move. They were still trying to extract cash from me while pretending they were doing me a favor by dropping a lawsuit they couldn't win. Vance didn't even look at Henderson. He slowly unscrewed the cap of his expensive fountain pen and laid it on the table. He looked directly at my father. Bob, Vance said. Not Mr. Robert. Just Bob. It was a calculated disrespect that immediately established dominance in the room. We are not here to negotiate a compromise. We are not here to discuss your grandchild's housing situation. We are here to dictate the terms of your surrender. My father bristled, his face flushing with anger. Now you listen here. We have witnesses who know about the family trust. You can't just bully us into submission. You have drinking buddies from the golf course who will commit perjury if you pay them. Vance shot back, his voice cracking like a whip, which you can't afford to do. So let's skip the posturing. You brought a frivolous lawsuit against my client to steal his property. My client countered. If you do not sign the document I am about to put in front of you, we go to trial. Vance leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. And if we go to trial, Bob, the first thing I am going to do is subpoena your complete financial history. I will compel you, under penalty of perjury, to explain exactly why you took out a massive second mortgage on your house. I will force you to read your bank statements out loud in a public courtroom, with all your friends and neighbors sitting in the gallery. The color drained from my father's face. He looked at Henderson, panic flashing in his eyes. Arthur, my mother whispered, her voice cracking. She reached a hand across the table, though she was miles away from touching me. Please, don't let him talk to your father like this. We are your family. I looked at her hand, hovering in the air. Then I looked at Caleb, who was staring at the table, his jaw clenched in impotent rage. Finally, I looked at my father, the man who had threatened to destroy my life because I refused to be his personal ATM. I reached forward and rested my hand on the black binder. It was time to drop the hammer. Family? I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing everyone in the room to hold their breath just to hear me. A family protects its members. You tried to cannibalize me. I flipped open the black binder. I didn't look at my notes. I had memorized every single number. Let's talk about the truth, I said, pulling out a stack of documents and sliding them precisely across the polished mahogany table toward their lawyer. Mr. Henderson picked them up, adjusting his glasses. Those are public records regarding my brother, Caleb, I stated. My eyes locked onto Caleb's face. Caleb shrank back into his heavy leather chair. 3 civil judgments for unpaid credit cards totaling $42,000. A vehicle repossession. A legally dissolved LLC due to tax delinquency. Caleb is legally insolvent. He has no assets, no income, and no ability to secure a lease anywhere in this city, let alone a luxury penthouse. Mr. Henderson flipped through the pages, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He looked at Caleb, clearly furious that his client had lied to him about his financial standing. I pulled out the next stack of papers and pushed them across the table. Now, let's look at the architects of this brilliant legal strategy, I continued, turning my gaze to my father. Those are the municipal property records for your primary residence. You have a second mortgage of $125,000. You also have UCC filings indicating high interest, short-term loans collateralized against your business equipment. You are bleeding cash, Dad. Arthur, stop! My mother cried out, tears spilling down her cheeks. You are embarrassing us in front of these strangers. I am just getting started, I said, my voice hardening into ice. I pulled out the final document, the merchant category code analysis. I didn't slide this one across the table. I held it up so my father could see it clearly. Code 7995, I said clearly. My father stopped breathing. He stared at the paper in my hand as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. The defiance completely vanished from his eyes, replaced by absolute, paralyzing terror. For the benefit of Mr. Henderson, I explained, never breaking eye contact with my father. Code 7995 is the banking classification for casino gaming and wagers. Over the last 5 years, Robert has systematically drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from his business and his home equity and funneled it directly into slot machines and card tables. Dad, Caleb gasped, turning to look at our father in shock. What is he talking about? You said the business was just slow. You said you had investments tied up. Shut up, Caleb. My father hissed, his voice trembling. He looked like a cornered rat. He lied to you, Caleb, I said smoothly. He lied to Mom, and he tried to lie to a judge. The reason he wanted my penthouse wasn't to give you a home for your baby. It was because he is about to lose his own house. He wanted to force me to transfer the deed so he could refinance my property, pull out $400,000 in equity, and pay off his gambling debts and your credit card judgments. The room descended into a suffocating silence. The air conditioning hummed gently in the background. The truth was out, ugly and undeniable, sitting on the mahogany table for everyone to see. I had stripped away every layer of their deception, exposing the desperate, greedy core of their actions. You didn't want a family home, I said, leaning back in my chair and closing the binder with a sharp, echoing snap. You wanted a bailout. You tried to use a pregnant woman and an unborn child as a human shield to commit real estate fraud against your own son. Henderson threw his pen down on his legal pad. He looked disgusted. He turned to my father. Bob, you assured me your finances were pristine. You assured me there was a legitimate oral agreement. If these records are accurate, and I have no doubt Mr. Vance has authenticated them, you have committed perjury on your initial filings. I cannot, and will not, represent you in a trial. My father put his face in his hands. He was a broken man. His empire of lies had collapsed in exactly 5 minutes. Vance slid a single, crisp legal document across the table. It rested perfectly in the center. This is a withdrawal with prejudice and a general release of all claims, Vance announced, his voice devoid of any mercy. It states that you withdraw your lawsuit immediately and permanently. It acknowledges that Arthur is the sole and undisputed owner of the property. Furthermore, it includes a strict non-disparagement clause. If any of you ever post Arthur's name on the internet again, or utter a word of this to your extended family, we will execute the $50,000 penalty clause attached to this document. Vance tapped the paper with his index finger. Sign it, or I file the subpoenas for the casino records at noon. My father stared at the document sitting in the middle of the table. It was a piece of paper that represented total defeat. It was the absolute end of his control over me, the end of his attempt to steal my wealth, and the end of his illusions of grandeur. His hands were shaking violently. He reached out and pulled the document toward him. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it meant. If he fought it, his country club friends, his business associates, and our entire extended family would find out he was a degenerate gambler who had bankrupted his family and tried to rob his own son. His ego simply couldn't survive that level of public humiliation. He picked up a pen provided by Mr. Henderson. He pressed the tip to the paper, his hand trembling so hard he almost ripped the parchment. He signed his name in a jagged, messy scrawl. He didn't look at me. He just pushed the paper toward my mother. My mother was openly weeping now, not the manipulative, calculated tears she used on the phone, but real, ugly tears of despair. She looked at the signature line, then looked up at me. Arthur, she whispered, her mascara running down her cheeks. Where are we supposed to go? If we lose the house, what are we going to do? You will do what you told me to do when I asked for help with college, I replied, my voice perfectly flat. You will figure it out. She flinched as if I had slapped her. She took the pen from my father and signed her name below his. Finally, the document was passed to Caleb. He sat there, staring at the signatures of his parents. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. There was no penthouse. There was no secret family money. His parents were broke, he was broke, and the brother he had always viewed as a lesser being had just legally annihilated them all. You think you're so smart? Caleb sneered, his voice dripping with venom, trying to salvage some shred of his shattered pride. You think you won, but you're just going to sit in that big, empty apartment all by yourself. You have no family. You have nobody. I have my peace, I said calmly, and I have my property. Sign the paper, Caleb, before I decide to sue you for the money you cost me in legal fees just to sit in this room today. Caleb snatched the pen and aggressively slashed his signature across the page. He threw the pen across the table. It clattered against Vance's water glass. Vance calmly retrieved the document. He inspected the 3 signatures, ensuring they were legitimate. He nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. He slipped the paper into his leather portfolio and clicked it shut. "We are concluded here," Vance said, standing up. "Henderson, file the withdrawal with the clerk by 3 o'clock today. I will have a courier deliver the executed copies to your office in the morning." Vance didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the boardroom. I stood up slowly. I picked up my black binder and tucked it under my arm. I looked at the 3 people sitting across from me. My father, with his face buried in his hands. My mother, sobbing quietly into a tissue. My brother, glaring at the wall with impotent rage. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. They were just strangers who shared my DNA, and I had successfully audited them out of my life. I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. I walked to the elevator banks. When the steel doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, dropping 40 floors toward the busy city streets, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. I had walked into that building carrying the heavy, suffocating baggage of a family that viewed me as a resource to be exploited. I was walking out as a man who belonged entirely to himself. The war was over. I had won. 6 months passed. Half a year of absolute, glorious silence. I didn't seek out information about my family, but when you come from a small, gossipy extended family, news eventually filters through the cracks. My Aunt Margaret, the same woman who had prayed for my soul on Facebook, sent me an email around Thanksgiving. She didn't apologize for her comments, but she couldn't resist delivering the tragic updates, hoping to provoke a reaction from me. I read the email over a cup of black coffee in my kitchen. The collapse of Robert and Patricia's empire had been swift and merciless. Without the influx of cash they had planned to steal from my penthouse equity, my father couldn't keep the plates spinning. The second mortgage lender foreclosed on their house. The 4-bedroom suburban home I grew up in, the driveway where Caleb had received his shiny BMW, was sold at a public auction. My parents were forced to liquidate my father's business equipment for pennies on the dollar just to avoid total bankruptcy. They moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown industrial town 40 miles outside the city limits. My father, the proud country club patriarch, was now working as a shift manager at a big-box hardware store, spending his days wearing a polyester vest and pointing customers toward the plumbing aisle. As for the golden boy, Caleb's reality check was even harsher. When Chloe realized that there was no penthouse, no secret family trust, and that her fiancé was actually tens of thousands of dollars in debt with no prospects, the illusion of the successful entrepreneur shattered. She broke off the engagement and moved back in with her parents in another state, taking the baby with her. Caleb was left completely isolated. With his credit ruined and no parents to bail him out, he couldn't secure a lease in the city. He ended up moving to a cheap, rural town in the Midwest, where he found a job driving a forklift in a massive logistics warehouse. He was working the exact same brutal, bone-crushing warehouse shifts I had worked when I was 18 just to survive. I read the email twice, archiving the information in my brain. I didn't feel a sense of vindictive joy, but I did feel a profound sense of justice. The universe, or perhaps just basic economics, had finally corrected the imbalance. The people who had mocked my hard work and demanded my sacrifice were now living the very life they had tried to force upon me. They were finally learning the lesson they had tried to teach me with a bus pass. The real world is cold, and you have to figure it out yourself. I deleted the email and permanently blocked my aunt's address. The books were closed. The audit was complete. I had no interest in reading the epilogue of a bankrupt company. With the threat neutralized and the legal fees paid, I refocused my energy on building my future. The penthouse, once a fortress under siege, finally became just a home. Because I held the undisputed, court-mandated title to the property, I took advantage of a drop in interest rates and refinanced my mortgage. My monthly payments decreased significantly. With the extra cash flow, I didn't buy a sports car or designer clothes. Instead, I drove down to my old state university. I walked into the financial aid office and sat down with the director. I signed the paperwork to establish a permanent endowment. It was an annual scholarship specifically designed for accounting students who maintained a high grade point average while working more than 30 hours a week to pay their tuition. I named it the David Vance Grit Scholarship, combining the names of the two men who had given me the tools to survive. Signing that endowment check provided a level of satisfaction that my parents' approval never could have achieved. I was using my wealth to build ladders for people like me, instead of letting it be used as a safety net for people who refused to work. A year after the lawsuit was dropped, I hosted another dinner party in my penthouse. This time, the guest list was strictly curated. David, my old mentor, sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly. Vance, my ruthless lawyer, was debating tax law with a few of my closest colleagues. There was no tension in the room. No one sneered at the velvet sofa. No one asked me invasive questions about my mortgage, and no one wore muddy shoes on my hardwood floors. I served the same aged steaks and poured the same expensive red wine. We ate, we drank, and we celebrated hard work, loyalty, and the family you choose for yourself. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone on my balcony. The city lights stretched out endlessly below me, a glittering ocean of concrete and glass. The wind was cool and sharp. I thought about the black binder sitting securely in my fireproof safe. It was full of ugly truths, lies, and the documented destruction of my biological family. I kept it not out of anger, but as a reminder. People will tell you that family is everything. They will tell you that blood is thicker than water, and that you owe an unpayable debt to the people who brought you into this world. But I learned the hard way that toxic people will use those exact phrases as a weapon to strip you of your boundaries, your sanity, and your assets. Protecting what you have built from parasites is not an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. You cannot set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm, especially when they are the ones holding the matches. I looked out over the city that I had conquered with my own two hands. I was Arthur. I was a forensic accountant. I tracked the dollars, I kept the receipts, and because I did, I got to keep my life. And I was never, ever giving it back.